Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. I'm writing this from my hospital bed in Portland. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive, that another 12 hours in hypothermia would have killed me. They keep asking what happened to the others. The police have been here 3 times already, and each time I tell them the same thing. They don't believe me. Maybe you won't either, but I need to get this out before the memories fade or twist into something worse. It started 6 weeks ago. I was 28, working as a software developer in Boston, spending most of my days staring at screens and most of my nights doing the same. My buddy Jake called me on a Tuesday evening in early October. "Remember that camping trip we talked about?" he said without preamble. "I'm serious this time. Found the perfect spot up in Maine, completely off the grid." Jake was always talking about getting away from civilization. He'd grown up in rural Vermont and never quite adjusted to city life. We'd been friends since college, and every few months he'd pitch some outdoor adventure that never materialized. "How far off the grid are we talking?" I asked, already knowing I'd say yes. The project I'd been working on had just wrapped up, and I had 2 weeks before the next one started. About 60 miles northwest of Baxter State Park, there's this area the locals call the 100-mile wilderness. We'd have to hike in about 15 miles from the nearest logging road. Who else is coming? Marcus and David from my CrossFit gym. Good guys. Marcus is ex-military, knows his way around the woods. David's a paramedic, so we'd have medical coverage if anything happens. I should have paid more attention to that last part. We spent the next 3 weeks planning. Jake handled the route mapping and permits. Marcus put together a comprehensive gear list that would have made REI jealous. David assembled a medical kit that could probably handle anything short of major surgery. I was in charge of food and cooking supplies, which seemed like the easiest job until I started calculating calories for 4 grown men, hiking 15 miles with full packs. The plan was simple. Drive up on a Thursday, camp at the trailhead, then hike in Friday morning. We'd set up a base camp and spend 5 days exploring the area before hiking back out the following Wednesday. Jake had found what he claimed was an old hunting camp on some outdated forestry maps, complete with a partially standing cabin we could use for shelter if the weather turned bad. I met Marcus and David the weekend before we left. Marcus was exactly what you'd expect from Jake's description. 6'3", built like a linebacker, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself in any situation. He showed us some basic wilderness survival skills in Jake's backyard, things like water purification and emergency shelter construction. David was Marcus's opposite, shorter, leaner, with nervous energy that had him constantly checking and rechecking our supplies. He walked us through the medical kit, showing us how to use everything from the satellite emergency beacon to the suture kit. The beacon's only for real emergencies, he emphasized. Search and rescue in that area could take days, even with exact coordinates. The Wednesday before we left, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. Not wrong exactly, just off. Like when you're coding and the program runs, but you know there's a logic error somewhere you haven't found yet. I almost called Jake to cancel, but I'd already taken the time off work and bought all the food. Besides, what would I say? That I had a bad feeling. Thursday morning came dark and rainy. I loaded my gear into Jake's truck at 4 a.m., the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Marcus and David were already there, their breath visible in the cold October air. We barely spoke during the 6-hour drive north, each of us lost in our own thoughts or sleeping fitfully against the windows. The last town we passed through was called Greenville, a small cluster of buildings huddled against Moosehead Lake. We stopped for gas and last-minute supplies. The elderly man running the station looked at our loaded truck and shook his head. "Heading up to the wilderness?" he asked. "Just for a few days," Jake replied. "We've got all the proper gear." The old man studied us for a long moment. "Been early snow up in the high country. Temperature's been dropping fast at night. You boys be careful." We thanked him. and continued north. The roads got progressively worse, from highway to two-lane blacktop to gravel to finally a rutted logging road that had Jake's truck groaning with every pothole. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was past noon, and the rain had turned to a light snow. The trailhead was nothing more than a small cleared area where the logging road dead-ended. No other vehicles, no trail markers, just a wall of trees and the faint impression of a path leading into the forest. We set up our tents quickly, eager to get out of the weather. That night, huddled in our sleeping bags while the wind rattled the tent walls, Jake spread out his maps by flashlight. "The trail's pretty clear for the first 8 miles, he explained, tracing the route with his finger. "Then we have to ford Miller's Creek and pick up the old Hunter's Trail on the other side. That's the tricky part. The trail hasn't been maintained in decades." "What about the cabin?" David asked. "Should be about 2 miles past the creek crossing, in a clearing near a small pond. The map's from 1978, so who knows what condition it's in." Marcus had been quiet most of the day, but now he spoke up. "Weather's supposed to clear tomorrow, but there's another system moving in Sunday night. We should have a contingency plan if we need to get out fast." We spent another hour going over emergency procedures. What to do if someone got injured, how to use the satellite beacon, rally points if we got separated. It all seemed overly cautious at the time. Now I wish we'd been even more paranoid. I didn't sleep well that night. The temperature had dropped into the 20s, and even in my 0-degree bag I was cold. But it wasn't just the cold keeping me awake. The forest was too quiet. No insects, no animals, just the wind and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow. When my watch showed 5 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep and started heating water for coffee. The others emerged from their tents soon after, everyone eager to get moving and warm up. We broke camp efficiently, divided up the group gear, and shouldered our packs. Jake took point with the GPS and map. I followed, then David, with Marcus bringing up the rear. The trail was easy to follow at first, a clear path through stands of birch and maple. Our boots crunched through the light covering of snow, and our breath formed clouds in the frigid morning air. For the first few hours, spirits were high. Jake pointed out various landmarks, Marcus identified animal tracks, and David kept us entertained with stories from his paramedic shifts. The snow had stopped and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. It was exactly the kind of adventure we'd all been craving. The trouble started when we reached Miller's Creek. Miller's Creek was supposed to be a minor obstacle. According to Jake's research, it was usually knee-deep at most, with plenty of rocks for crossing. But October had been unusually wet, and the snowmelt from the early storm had turned the creek into a rushing torrent. We stood on the bank, watching brown water surge past carrying branches and debris. The crossing point Jake had marked was completely submerged. The water had to be at least 4 feet deep in the center, moving fast enough to knock a man off his feet. "There has to be another crossing," Jake said, consulting his map again. "Maybe upstream where it's narrower." We spent an hour hiking along the bank, looking for a better spot. The creek only seemed to get wider and faster. Finally, Marcus called a halt. "We need to make a decision," he said. "Either we cross here, we go back, or we try to find a way around." "Going around could add miles to the hike," Jake protested. "We might not make the cabin before dark." David was crouched by the water, testing the temperature. "It's cold, really cold. If someone falls in, we're looking at immediate hypothermia risk." I watched the water rushing past and felt that same unease from Wednesday night. Something was wrong here. The creek was too high, too fast. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep us out. "What about roping across?" Marcus suggested. "I've got 100 feet of static line. We could rig a safety system." It took another hour to set up. Marcus waded in first, fighting the current, with the rope tied around his waist. The rest of us held the other end, ready to pull him back if he lost his footing. Twice he had to retreat when the water reached his chest. On the third try, he found a route that kept him in shallower water, using a series of partially submerged rocks. Once across, he secured the rope to a tree, and we had our lifeline. Jake went next, then David. Both made it across, though David slipped once and had to be hauled in by the rope. I went last. The water was shockingly cold, like liquid ice that immediately numbed my legs. Halfway across, my foot slipped on a moss-covered rock. For a moment I was horizontal, the current trying to sweep me downstream, only the rope keeping me from being carried away. Marcus and Jake hauled me in like a fish, and I crawled onto the far bank, gasping and shivering. "Everyone okay?" Marcus asked once I'd caught my breath. We all nodded, but I could see the crossing had rattled everyone. Our pants were soaked and already starting to freeze in the cold air. We had to get moving to warm up. The old hunter's trail was harder to find than Jake had anticipated. We spent 30 minutes casting about in the underbrush before Marcus spotted a faint blaze on a tree trunk. 3 parallel scratches that might have been made by claws or might have been trail markers from decades past. The trail, such as it was completely overgrown. We had to push through thick undergrowth, branches catching on our packs and clothes. The snow had melted here under the canopy, leaving everything wet and slippery. Our progress slowed to less than a mile an hour. By early afternoon, we were exhausted and still hadn't reached the cabin. Jake kept checking the GPS, growing more frustrated with each reading. "We should be there by now," he muttered. "The distances don't make sense." That's when we found the first campsite. It was just off the trail, a small clearing with a fire ring made of stones. What caught our attention were the items scattered around: a torn sleeping bag, some rusted cans, a boot with the sole separated from the upper. Everything was weathered and old, but not ancient. Maybe a year or two at most. David picked up a water bottle, examining it closely. "This is the same model I have. They only started making these last year." We spread out, searching the area. Marcus found scratch marks on several trees, too regular to be natural. I discovered what looked like dried blood on some leaves, though it was old enough that I couldn't be certain. "Someone left in a hurry," Marcus said quietly. "Or was taken." "Taken by what?" Jake asked. "A bear?" Marcus shrugged, but I could see he was troubled. We'd all noticed the complete absence of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and our own footsteps. We pushed on, no one wanting to camp near the abandoned site. The trail grew even fainter, sometimes disappearing entirely. We navigated by compass and GPS, bushwhacking through increasingly dense forest. It was nearly dark when we finally stumbled into the clearing with the cabin. Cabin was a generous term. It was more of a ruin, 3 walls still standing, the 4th collapsed inward along with most of the roof. The logs were gray with age and rot, gaps between them big enough to put your fist through. Still, it was shelter of a sort. "Home sweet home," Jake said, trying to sound cheerful. We set up our tents in the clearing, using the cabin as a windbreak. Marcus and I gathered firewood while Jake and David prepared dinner. Soon we had a good fire going, the flames pushing back the darkness and cold. The freeze-dried meals tasted better than they had any right to after the day we'd had. We sat around the fire, exhausted but satisfied that we'd made it to our destination. The sky had cleared and stars were visible through gaps in the canopy. "Tomorrow we can explore the area," Jake said, planning already. "There's supposed to be some old growth forest to the north, and that pond should have good fishing." We turned in early, worn out from the difficult hike. I fell asleep almost immediately, too tired to worry about the abandoned campsite or the unnatural quiet of the forest. I woke to the sound of screaming. The scream cut through the night like a blade, high-pitched, agonized, utterly human. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering. Beside me, Jake was fumbling for his flashlight. "What was that?" he whispered. Another scream, longer this time, coming from somewhere beyond the cabin. It was joined by a second voice, lower, making sounds that weren't quite words, but weren't quite animal either. We scrambled out of the tent. Marcus was already outside, standing by the dead fire with a flashlight in one hand and a large knife in the other. David emerged from his tent a moment later. "That sounded human," David said, his medical training overriding fear. "Someone's hurt." "Or something wants us to think someone's hurt," Marcus countered. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. We stood in a tight circle, flashlights sweeping the forest edge. Nothing moved beyond the reach of our lights. "We have to check," David insisted. "If someone's injured." "No one goes anywhere alone," Marcus interrupted. "And no one leaves the camp until daylight." Jake was shaking beside me, and I realized it wasn't from cold. "That wasn't an animal," he said. "Animals don't sound like that." We rebuilt the fire, no one willing to go back to sleep. Marcus retrieved a pistol from his pack, something he hadn't mentioned having, and kept it close. We sat with our backs to the flames, watching the darkness. An hour passed, then 2. Just as I was starting to think we'd imagined it, we heard movement in the underbrush, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the camp. Our flashlight beams caught nothing but trees and shadows. "There," David hissed, pointing. For just a moment at the very edge of the light, I saw eyes reflecting back at us. Human height, human spacing. But the way they moved was wrong. Too fluid, too quick. Then they were gone. The footsteps continued, always just out of sight. Sometimes they seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. "The fire," Marcus said suddenly. "Keep it big, keep it bright." We fed the flames until they roared head high, throwing light and shadows in equal measure. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel them watching, waiting. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough to see without flashlights, Marcus stood. "We're checking the perimeter," he announced. "Jake, you're with me, David, and—" He looked at me. "You stay here. Keep the fire going." They made a circuit of the camp, checking for tracks or signs of what had visited us. I saw them stop several times, Marcus pointing at the ground, Jake growing paler with each discovery. When they returned, Marcus's expression was grim. "We need to leave. Now." "What did you find?" David asked. Marcus hesitated before answering. "Tracks. Barefoot human tracks, dozens of them, all around the camp, some within 10 feet of the tents." "Barefoot?" I repeated. "In this cold?" "That's not the worst part," Jake said, voice shaking. "Some of the tracks, the toes were wrong, too long, and there were drag marks like they were pulling something." We broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into packs without the usual careful organization. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same urgency to get away from this place. As we were loading the last items, David made a discovery that changed everything. "The satellite beacon," he said, holding up the device. "It's broken." We gathered around as he showed us the damage. The case was cracked, the antenna bent at an impossible angle. It looked like someone had stepped on it or crushed it in a vise. "When did you check it last?" Marcus asked. "Yesterday at the creek crossing. It was fine then." Which meant sometime during the night, while we sat around the fire, something had gone through our packs and deliberately destroyed our only way to call for help. "We stick to the plan," Marcus said after a long pause. "Hike out the way we came. Move fast, stay together. We can make it in one day if we push hard." No one mentioned that it had taken us all day to get here while fresh. No one mentioned that we'd have to cross Miller's Creek again. No one mentioned that whatever had stalked us in the night might follow us. We set off at a brutal pace, Marcus leading with the GPS. The trail seemed even fainter than before, as if the forest was actively trying to erase our path. More than once we had to stop and search for the route. It was during one of these searches that Jake found the bone. It was a human femur, no doubt about it, gnawed at both ends with teeth marks that didn't match any animal I knew. Jake dropped it like it was burning and stumbled backward. "We're not the first ones here," he said unnecessarily. Marcus examined the bone without touching it. Old breaks, spiral fractures. This person was alive when... He didn't finish. We kept moving, but now every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound might be footsteps. The forest pressed in on us, dense and watchful. I found myself glancing back constantly, certain we were being followed. Around noon, we reached the abandoned campsite from yesterday, except it wasn't abandoned anymore. A figure sat by the old fire ring back to us, wearing the shredded remains of hiking gear. It didn't move as we approached, didn't react to our calls. Marcus held up a hand, stopping us, then circled wide to get a better view. He returned quickly, face white. Dead. Been dead for days at least. Animals have been at him. That's impossible, David said. We were here yesterday. There was no body. But there was now. We gave it a wide berth, no one wanting to look too closely. The implications were clear. Something had placed it there. A warning, a message, or just a sick game. We pushed harder, taking risks on uncertain trail sections rather than slow down to search. The sun was already descending when we finally heard the rush of Miller's Creek. The water was even higher than yesterday. We stood on the bank of Miller's Creek, staring at the churning water in disbelief. The rope we'd used to cross was gone, along with several feet of the bank where Marcus had secured it. The creek had risen at least 2 feet, turning coffee brown with runoff and debris. This isn't possible, Jake said. There hasn't been any rain. Where is all this water coming from? Marcus was already scouting upstream and downstream, looking for alternatives. David and I started gathering driftwood, thinking we might be able to construct some kind of raft, but the wood was all waterlogged and rotten, breaking apart in our hands. There's no good crossing for at least a mile in either direction, Marcus reported when he returned, and it's getting dark. We all knew what that meant. Another night in the forest. Another night with whatever had stalked us at the cabin. We may camp here, Marcus decided. Close to the water, backs protected, big fire, watches through the night. We found a small rise about 50 yards from the creek, with good sight lines in most directions. The sound of rushing water would mask approaching footsteps, but it would also mask our own movements if we needed to run. As we set up a defensive position, I noticed Jake standing apart, staring at his GPS with a puzzled expression. "What's wrong?" I asked. He showed me the screen. "We're not where we should be. According to this, we're 3 miles north of yesterday's crossing point." "That's impossible. We followed the same trail." "I know." He looked scared. "Either the GPS is malfunctioning or the forest itself was shifting around us." It sounded insane, but after everything else, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. We built our fire larger than before, arranging our tents in a tight triangle with the fire in the center. Marcus showed us how to set up noisemakers, cans with pebbles, paracord strung with metal items that would clatter if disturbed. It felt like preparing for a siege. Darkness fell like a curtain. One moment we could see the trees across the clearing, the next they were swallowed by black. The fire seemed smaller suddenly, its light a fragile bubble in an ocean of dark. We ate cold food, no one wanting to turn their back on the forest long enough to cook. Conversation was sparse, everyone listening for sounds beyond the crackle of flames and rush of water. "We should talk about what we're dealing with," David said eventually. "Those tracks, the bones, the body appearing." "People," Marcus said firmly. "Sick, twisted people living out here, but people. Nothing we can't handle if we stay alert." I wanted to believe him, but I kept thinking about those eyes in the darkness, the way they'd moved, and the tracks. Human but wrong, like something pretending to be human had gotten the details slightly off. "What kind of people live barefoot in the Maine wilderness in October?" Jake asked. "What kind of people can survive out here without gear, without shelter?" "The kind we don't want to meet," Marcus replied. The first sounds came around midnight. Not screams this time, but voices. Distant at first, carrying on the wind. Multiple speakers, their words incomprehensible but clearly some kind of language. It rose and fell in patterns that might have been conversation or might have been ritual chanting. "They're between us and the truck," Jake whispered, checking his GPS again. "At least a dozen distinct voices." The voices grew closer, spreading out to surround us. We could hear movement in the underbrush, deliberately careless, letting us know they were there. Our pile of firewood was shrinking fast. "Movement left," Marcus called out, swinging his flashlight. The beam caught a flash of pale flesh before it vanished into the trees. Not an animal. Definitely not an animal. More movement to the right. Behind us. They were circling, testing our response. David had grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch. Jake was gripping his camp hatchet with white knuckles. Then they started throwing things. Rocks at first, fist-sized stones that crashed into our camp from multiple directions. One hit a tent, tearing through the rainfly. Another knocked over our water bottles. They weren't trying to hit us, not yet, just letting us know they could. "Stay in the light," Marcus ordered. "Don't chase them into the dark." A larger object sailed out of the darkness, a rotting deer head, eyes gone, flesh hanging in strips. It landed in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks and a horrific smell. More objects followed, bones, pieces of clothing that might have belonged to other hikers, a child's shoe that made my stomach turn. Each throw was accompanied by what sounded like laughter, but wrong, like someone who had forgotten how human laughter was supposed to sound. "They're trying to scare us out," Marcus said. "Make us run. Don't give them what they want." But I could see fear in his eyes too. Whatever training he'd had, it hadn't prepared him for this. The bombardment stopped as suddenly as it had started. The voices faded back, but not far. We could still hear them out there, waiting. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the need to add wood to the fire. "Sun up in 2 hours," David announced, checking his watch. "We move at first light." That's when they rushed us. They came from 3 directions at once, pale figures erupting from the darkness. Not running exactly, but moving in a horrible scuttling gait that covered ground faster than it should have. Marcus's pistol cracked once, twice. I saw one figure stumble but keep coming. David swung his torch in wide arcs, trying to keep them at bay. Jake stood frozen, hatchet hanging uselessly at his side. I grabbed a burning log and thrust it at the nearest attacker. In the flickering light, I got my first clear look at what we were facing. It had been human once, maybe still was, technically, but living in the wilderness had changed it into something else. Skin pale as paper, stretched tight over bones, hair long and matted with filth, fingers extended into claws by broken, untrimmed nails, and the eyes, God, the eyes were the worst part. Still intelligent, still aware, but filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It recoiled from the fire but didn't retreat. Instead, it circled, looking for an opening. Others pressed in from different angles. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more. "Back to back," Marcus shouted. "Keep the fire between us and them." We formed a tight circle, weapons facing outward. The creatures, I couldn't think of them as people anymore, prowled around us, testing our defenses. One would feint an attack, drawing our attention, while another tried to slip through our guard. Jake finally snapped out of his paralysis when one got close enough to grab his pack. He swung the hatchet in a wild arc, catching the thing across the arm. It made a sound between a scream and a hiss, black blood spraying from the wound. That seemed to be some kind of signal. They all attacked at once. The next few minutes were chaos. They came at us like animals, all teeth and claws and inhuman shrieks. Marcus's pistol fired again and again until it clicked empty. David's torch swept back and forth, leaving trails of fire in the air. Jake's hatchet rose and fell, spraying blood with each impact. I fought with the desperation of pure terror, swinging the burning log like a club. Every time I connected, there was a wet sound and a scream, but they kept coming. One latched onto my backpack, trying to drag me down. I spun, slamming it into the fire. It released me with a howl, rolling on the ground to extinguish its burning rags. "The creek!" Marcus yelled. "Get to the water!" It was insane. The creek that had trapped us might now save us. We fought our way toward the sound of rushing water, leaving the relative safety of our fire. The creatures followed, their cries growing more frenzied. David went down first. 2 of them hit him from the side, bearing him to the ground. His screams cut through everything else. Jake tried to help, but another creature blindsided him, teeth sinking into his shoulder. Marcus and I reached the bank. Without hesitation, he grabbed my arm and jumped, pulling me with him into the freezing water. The cold was like being hit by a truck. Every muscle seized, every thought driven from my head except the need to breathe. The current caught us immediately, sweeping us downstream. I caught glimpses of the bank, the creatures running alongside, David's torch abandoned and guttering out, Jake stumbling after us with blood streaming down his arm. Marcus kept hold of me as we tumbled through the rapids. Rocks battered us from every side. Water filled my mouth and nose. Just when I thought I would drown, we slammed into a fallen tree spanning the creek. "Climb!" Marcus gasped. I hauled myself onto the log, coughing up water. Marcus followed, and together we pulled ourselves to the far bank. We'd been carried at least 100 yards downstream. "David," I gasped. "Jake, move!" Marcus cut me off, dragging me to my feet. We ran. Branches tore at our soaked clothes. Our boots squelched with every step. Behind us, inhuman voices howled in frustration. They'd have to find another crossing point, buying us precious time. We stumbled through the forest, hypothermia already setting in. My hands were numb, feet like blocks of ice. Marcus wasn't doing much better, his movements growing sluggish. "Have to warm up," he managed through chattering teeth. "Or we're dead anyway." We found a cluster of fallen trees that formed a natural windbreak. Marcus fumbled out waterproof matches from an inner pocket. Thank God for military training. Using dry inner bark and twigs from under the logs, we got a small fire going. "Strip," he ordered. "Wet clothes will kill us." We peeled off our soaked outer layers, huddling close to the pathetic flames. Slowly, painfully, warmth returned to our extremities. With it came the full horror of what had happened. "David's dead," I said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded grimly. Jake might have made it to the water, might have gotten across somewhere else. We both knew how unlikely that was. As our clothes dried and dawn broke properly, we took stock. Marcus had his knife, the waterproof matches, and a small emergency kit in a waterproof pouch. I had nothing. Everything had been in my pack, now abandoned at the campsite. "We keep moving," Marcus decided. "No GPS, but if we follow the creek downstream, we'll hit civilization eventually." What were those things? He was quiet for a long moment. Maybe people who got lost out here, years ago, decades, living like animals, hunting, surviving, inbreeding, each generation more feral than the last. "They planned it," I said. "The beacon, moving the body, raising the creek somehow." "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't try to make sense of it. Just focus on getting out." We followed the creek as the sun climbed higher. No trails now, just bushwhacking through increasingly thick forest. Every sound made us freeze. Every shadow could hide pursuit. It was afternoon when we found Jake. He was sitting with his back against a tree, maybe a mile downstream from where we'd crossed. At first I thought he was resting. Then I saw the blood. "Jake!" I rushed to him. Marcus close behind. He was alive, barely. Pale from blood loss, multiple wounds seeping through makeshift bandages torn from his shirt. His eyes flickered open when I touched his shoulder. "Hey," he whispered. "Fancy meeting you here." "We're getting you out," I said, though one look at his injuries told me otherwise. Marcus was already checking the wounds with practiced efficiency. His expression told the whole story. Jake saw it too. "How bad?" Jake asked. "Bad," Marcus admitted. "Without proper medical attention." "Yeah," Jake coughed, specks of blood on his lips. "Figured. Least I made it across. Showed those bastards." We made him as comfortable as possible. Marcus gave him the last of his water. I piled leaves around him for warmth. We both knew we couldn't carry him, not in our condition, not with those things still hunting us. "Go," Jake said, "before they find another crossing." "We'll send help," I promised, "as soon as we reach a road." He smiled weakly. "Sure. Tell my mom." He paused, gathering strength. "Tell her I went out fighting, not at a desk, fighting." We left him there. What else could we do? Marcus had to practically drag me away, Jake's form growing smaller between the trees until he vanished entirely. The rest of that day blurred together. Walk, rest, listen for pursuit, walk more. The creek led us through a seemingly endless wilderness, each bend looking like the last. As darkness approached again, we faced another night in the forest. "We can't stop," I said. "They'll find us if we stop." "We'll collapse if we don't rest," Marcus countered. "And traveling these woods in the dark is suicide." We compromised, finding a defensive position on a small hill with good visibility. No fire this time. We couldn't risk the smoke giving away our position. We sat back to back, taking turns dozing fitfully. Sometime after midnight, we heard them. Not close, but not far enough. Voices calling to each other in that not-quite-human language. They'd found our trail. We moved out immediately, using what little moonlight filtered through the canopy to navigate. Twice, we had to backtrack when the terrain became impassable. The voices grew closer. Dawn found us at the edge of a small ravine, the creek tumbling over a 20-foot waterfall. Behind us, branches cracked. They were close now. Very close. "We jump," Marcus said. I looked at the pool below. Dark water, no telling how deep. Rocks visible at the edges. That's crazy. So is staying here. A figure emerged from the trees 50 yards back. Then another, and another. They'd found us. Marcus grabbed my hand. "On three, 1, 2. We jumped. The fall lasted forever, and no time at all. I had a moment to see the creatures reach the cliff edge above, their howls of rage following us down. Then I hit the water. It was deeper than I'd dared hope, but the impact still drove all air from my lungs. I plunged down into darkness, the cold 1,000 needles piercing every inch of skin. My feet touched bottom, rocks and silt, and I pushed off hard, clawing for the surface. I broke through, gasping, immediately caught by the current. The pool fed into another stretch of rapids. I caught a glimpse of Marcus's head, bobbing nearby before the water pulled me under again. The next minutes were a nightmare of churning water and crushing rocks. I ricocheted off boulders, each impact adding new bruises to my collection. Just staying oriented became a challenge. Which way was up? Where was air? Finally, the rapids spit me out into calmer water. I dragged myself onto a sandy bank, retching and coughing. Marcus crawled up beside me moments later, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "You all right?" he gasped. I nodded, unable to speak. Everything hurt. My clothes were shredded, skin scraped raw in a dozen places. But I was alive. Marcus forced himself upright, scanning the banks. "They'll find a way down." We bought time, not safety. We stumbled on, following the creek as it wound through a narrow valley. The walls were too steep to climb, forcing us to stay near the water. Our progress was agonizingly slow, every step an effort. The sun climbed higher, offering some warmth to our battered bodies. No sounds of pursuit yet, but we both knew they were coming. Those things had survived in this wilderness for God knows how long. They wouldn't give up easily. Around midday, we found evidence of civilization. An old wooden sign, weathered but readable. Logging Road 47, 2 miles. 2 miles, I repeated, hardly daring to believe it. We can make 2 miles. But Marcus was studying the forest around us with growing concern. This is still their territory. They'll know we're heading for the road. Might try to cut us off. We pushed harder, ignoring exhaustion and pain. The creek valley widened, giving us more options for travel. We stayed in the trees when possible, avoiding open areas where we'd be visible from a distance. It was the silence that warned us. The normal forest sounds, birds, insects, small animals, cut off like someone had thrown a switch. We froze, listening. They came from upslope, moving parallel to us, not charging this time, but pacing us, waiting for an opportunity. We caught glimpses through the trees, pale shapes flitting between trunks, always keeping their distance. They're hurting us, Marcus realized, pushing us towards something. Sure enough, the terrain ahead funneled into a narrow gap between two rock outcroppings, perfect for an ambush. We stopped, considering options. "We go around," I suggested. "Climb the ridge." In our condition, we'd never make it. Marcus pulled out his knife, testing the edge. Sometimes the only way out is through. We approached the gap carefully, every sense alert. Nothing moved in the shadows between the rocks. Too quiet, too still. Marcus went first, knife ready. I followed close behind, wielding a sturdy branch I'd picked up. The gap was maybe 30 feet long, walls rising 20 feet on either side. Halfway through, I knew we'd made a mistake. They dropped from above. The first one landed directly on Marcus, driving him to the ground. Another fell just behind me, cutting off retreat. More shapes appeared at both ends of the gap. Marcus rolled, somehow getting on top of his attacker. His knife flashed, and inhuman screams echoed off the rock walls. I swung my branch desperately, trying to keep the others at bay. One got past my guard, raking claws across my back. Fire erupted along my spine. I spun, catching it in the temple with the branch. Bone cracked, and it dropped. Marcus was up again, knife bloody, but more were closing in. Too many. We were going to die here, torn apart by these things that had once been human. That's when we heard the engines. Chainsaws, multiple chainsaws, their angry buzz cutting through everything else. The creatures' heads snapped toward the sound, their attack faltering. Men burst from the forest, loggers in hard hats and fluorescent vests, chainsaws roaring. The creatures scattered immediately, vanishing into the trees with inhuman speed. In seconds, the gap was clear, except for the two Marcus and I had dropped. The lead logger, a massive bearded man, shut off his saw. "Jesus Christ, you boys all right?" I tried to answer and found I couldn't. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the ground. Marcus leaned against the rock wall, chest heaving. "We need medical attention," he managed. "And police. Our friends. There were 4 of us." The logger's expression darkened. "The Farrells got your friends?" "Farrells?" I asked. "What we call them. Been living out here for decades, maybe longer. Forest Service says they don't exist, but us locals know better." He gestured to his crew. "That's why we don't work alone out here. Ever." They had ATVs parked nearby. The ride to the logging road was a blur of pain and relief. An ambulance was already waiting. Apparently, the logging crew had radioed ahead. As the EMTs worked on us, I heard Marcus talking to a state police officer, describing the attack, the location of our camp. The officer looked skeptical until one of the loggers backed us up. "It's true," the bearded logger said. "Every few years, hikers go missing out there. Sometimes we find bodies. Sometimes we don't find nothing." "Why hasn't anyone done something?" I demanded. The logger shrugged. "Do what?" "That's hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They know every inch. Been tried before. Search teams, even National Guard once. The Farrells just disappeared deeper into the forest. Waited out. They're smarter than they look." The ambulance took us to a hospital in Bangor. Police interviewed us separately, multiple times. Search and rescue teams went in looking for Jake and David. They found blood, torn gear, signs of struggle. No bodies. The official report blamed a bear attack. Easier to explain, easier to accept. But some of the search team members told a different story, off the record. They'd found tracks, seen things moving in the trees, heard voices that weren't quite human. They called off the search after a week. I spent 6 days in the hospital. The claw marks on my back required 43 stitches. Various other injuries, exposure, dehydration, trauma, kept me bedbound while police and park rangers asked the same questions over and over. Marcus was released after 3 days. He came to see me before leaving, moving stiffly from his own injuries. "They're not going to do anything," he said without preamble. "Official story is we got lost, panicked. Jake and David died from exposure or animals. Case closed. But the loggers don't officially exist. Their statements weren't included in the report." He sat carefully in the visitor's chair. "I've been doing research. This isn't the first time. Goes back decades, maybe longer. Hikers vanishing, bodies found in strange circumstances, survivor stories that don't make the news. So they just get away with it. Those things keep hunting people and nobody stops them." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What would you do? Send in the army?" Evacuate and bomb the entire forest? They're not animals you can trap. They're smart. They've survived out there for generations. He left me with a warning. Don't talk to the media. Don't post online. Don't become the crazy guy ranting about monsters in the woods. Nobody would believe me anyway. But I couldn't let it go. After my release, I spent weeks researching. Old newspapers, hiking forums, missing person reports. The pattern was there if you looked. Clusters of disappearances in the same general area. Survivors telling similar stories before being dismissed or discredited. I found a report from 1952 about a logging crew that vanished. One survivor claimed they were attacked by wild men of the forest. He was institutionalized, a family camping in 1978. Only the youngest daughter was found, catatonic, clutching human teeth that didn't match any of her family members. 3 experienced hikers in 1991. One made it out, babbling about pale creatures that walked like men. The police report noted he was suffering from severe hypothermia and hallucinations. The list went on. I tried contacting other survivors. Most wouldn't talk to me. The few who did spoke in whispers, constantly checking over their shoulders. They'd moved far from Maine. Changed their names in some cases. All of them had the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror. One woman, a survivor from 2018, met me in a crowded Boston cafe. She'd lost her husband and brother out there. "They're not human anymore," she said, hands trembling around her coffee cup. Maybe they never were. Maybe they're what happens when people get lost out there and never find their way back. The forest changes them, makes them into something else. "Someone must know," I insisted. "The government, the Forest Service." She laughed bitterly. "Of course they know. They just can't do anything about it. So they pretend it's not happening. Mark the area as hazardous, discourage hikers, hope the problem stays contained." Contained? People are dying. People die in the wilderness all the time. Bear attacks, exposure, getting lost, plenty of explanations that don't require acknowledging that we've got a population of feral humans living like animals in the deep woods. She leaned forward. "You want my advice? Forget this happened. Move on. Don't end up like me, jumping at shadows for the rest of your life." But I couldn't forget. Jake and David deserved better than being written off as casualties of bad weather. Their families deserved the truth, even if they'd never get it officially. I tracked down Jake's mother in Vermont. Told her he died fighting like he'd asked. I didn't tell her what he was fighting. She didn't need that nightmare. David's family was harder. They wanted answers I couldn't give, details that would only horrify them. I stuck to the official story, a tragic accident, over quickly. Let them have peace. Marcus and I stayed in touch for a while. He was dealing with his own trauma, throwing himself into work, pretending normalcy, but I could hear it in his voice during our calls. He was breaking down, same as me. "I see them sometimes," he admitted one night. Drunk. In crowds, in shadows. Those eyes. I know it's not real, but I can't shake it. 6 months after the attack, I quit my job. Couldn't concentrate on code when every unexpected sound made me reach for a weapon. Couldn't sit in meetings pretending to care about sprint planning and deployment schedules when I knew what was out there in the dark. I moved south, far from any wilderness. Took a remote position with a new company, one that didn't ask too many questions about the gap in my resume. Started seeing a therapist, though I could never tell her the whole truth. The nightmares were the worst part. Always the same, running through dark woods, something pale and hungry right behind me. Jake and David calling for help I couldn't give, waking up screaming, sheets soaked with sweat. A year passed. The physical scars faded, but the mental ones remained raw. I developed habits that worried my few remaining friends, always sitting with my back to walls, checking exits obsessively, flinching at unexpected movements. Then Marcus called with news that explained so much. "I hired a private investigator," he said, "to look into the history of that area. You need to hear what he found." The investigator was a former state trooper named Patterson who specialized in cold cases. Marcus had given him everything: our testimonies, the coordinates, the dates. What Patterson uncovered went deeper than either of us had imagined. There was a logging town there in the 1890s, Patterson explained over a secure video call, called Miller's Camp, about 2,000 residents at its peak, supported by the Penobscot Log Driving Company. He shared his screen, showing old photographs of a bustling frontier town. Men in suspenders and bowler hats, a general store, a church with a modest steeple. Winter of 1897 was brutal, he continued. Record snowfall, temperatures 40 below. Supply lines cut off for 3 months. When spring came and the logging company sent inspectors, they found the town empty. Empty? Marcus asked. Not a soul, no bodies either. Just an abandoned town with signs of violence. Bloodstains, claw marks on doors, furniture barricaded against windows. Official report blamed disease and starvation, said the residents must have tried to walk out and died in the forest. Patterson pulled up another document. But there were rumors. Trappers and natives in the area talked about seeing the townsfolk in the woods, changed, wild, hunting in packs. That's over 100 years ago, I protested. Gets stranger, Patterson said. I found records of 3 separate attempts to resettle the area, 1923, 1938, and 1951. Each time, the new residents vanished or fled within a year. The last attempt, the government finally declared the whole region off limits. But it's not off limits, Marcus said. We got permits. There are trails. Patterson nodded grimly. Officially, yes, but look at the actual maps. The trails skirt the real deep wilderness. The area you entered? That's what locals call the dead zone. Forest Service doesn't maintain trails there, doesn't do controlled burns, doesn't send rangers. They've essentially ceded that territory. He showed us more documents, internal Forest Service memos warning about dangerous wildlife, budget allocations for population management with no details, reports with heavy redactions. They know, I said. They've always known. My theory? Patterson leaned back. Whatever happened to that logging town, whether it was starvation or disease or something else, it created a population that adapted to the wilderness in ways humans aren't supposed to. Generations of isolation, inbreeding, possible dietary irregularities. They're not quite human anymore. Dietary irregularities, Marcus repeated. You mean cannibalism? Among other things. The forensic evidence I've been able to access suggests they're omnivorous but protein-starved, hence the aggressive hunting behavior. How many? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Patterson shrugged. Impossible to say. Based on territorial patterns and resource availability, could be dozens, could be hundreds. They seem to have a complex social structure, possibly tribal, and they're smart enough to avoid large groups and armed responses. So what happens now? Marcus demanded. We just pretend they don't exist. That's exactly what happens, Patterson said. Has been happening for over a century. Containment through obscurity. As long as they stay in their territory and only take the occasional hiker, it's easier to deny they exist than deal with the reality. He sent us his full report. Hundreds of pages of evidence, testimonies, and theories. Reading it, I understood why the authorities preferred denial. What were the alternatives? Acknowledge that we had a population of feral humans living in our national forests? The panic alone would be devastating. Marcus became obsessed with forcing action. He contacted journalists, environmentalists, anyone who might listen. Most dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist. The few who showed interest quickly backed off after making their own inquiries. You're fighting a system that's been in place for generations, Patterson warned him. People in power have decided that a few missing hikers per year is an acceptable loss compared to the alternative. I took a different path. I started documenting everything. My experience, the research, other survivor accounts. Not to expose or force action, but to warn. To maybe save some future hiker from walking into that nightmare. I created anonymous guides for hiking forums, warning about specific areas without mentioning why. Suggested alternate routes that skirted the dead zone. Posted equipment lists that included items useful for defense disguised as bear country preparations. Some people listened. Others called me paranoid. But if even one person avoided that fate because of my warnings, it was worth it. 3 years have passed now. The nightmares have faded to occasional bad dreams. I can function, work, maintain relationships, though I'll never be who I was before. That person died in the Maine woods along with Jake and David. Marcus eventually gave up his crusade, worn down by official indifference and public skepticism. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, about as far from deep forests as you can get. Patterson still sends me updates occasionally. More disappearances, always explained away. More sightings dismissed as misidentification. The cycle continues. Sometimes I think about them out there. The ferals. Whatever they are, wherever they came from, they're part of that forest now. As much as the trees and rocks and streams. Evolution's cruel joke. Humans returned to the wild, transformed into something our ancestors would have recognized as monsters. I know I should hate them for what they did to my friends. But sometimes in my dreams, I see them differently. Not monsters, but warnings. What we could become if civilization fails us. What waits in the dark when we stray too far from the light. The Maine woods are beautiful, ancient, full of wonder and mystery. But they're also hungry. And some mysteries are better left undiscovered. If you're reading this, planning your own adventure into the deep wilderness, I have one piece of advice. Don't. There are plenty of other places to hike, plenty of other challenges to face. The risk isn't worth it, because I can tell you from experience, some forests don't want visitors, and some never let them leave. I've told my story. Whether you believe it is up to you. But if you're ever in northern Maine, and locals warn you away from certain areas, maybe you'll remember this. Maybe you'll listen. Maybe you'll live. Jake Winters, 29. David Chen, 31. They deserved better than becoming statistics. This is my testimony. This is their memorial. And this is my warning. I'm writing this because I need people to know what happened in the Allagash wilderness. The police don't believe me. My family thinks I'm having a breakdown. But I know what I saw, and I know why my 3 best friends never came home. It started as a simple bachelor party weekend. My buddy Marcus was getting married in October, and we wanted to do something different. No strip clubs or Vegas nonsense. Marcus had always been the outdoorsy type, so when he suggested a camping trip to northern Maine, we jumped at it. Jake, Tyler, Marcus, and me, we'd been friends since college, and this felt like the perfect way to celebrate before Marcus tied the knot. I should have paid attention to the warning signs. When we stopped at the last supply store in Allagash, the elderly clerk kept asking if we were sure about heading into the deep woods. "Lot of strange things been happening out there lately," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Folks been seeing things, hearing things." We laughed it off. City boys making fun of rural superstitions. We were idiots. Marcus had found the location on some obscure hiking forum, a supposedly pristine camping spot about 20 miles past the end of the logging roads, accessible only by a challenging hike through dense forest. Completely untouched, he'd said. We'll be the only people for miles. The hike in took us most of Friday. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely visible, marked only by occasional faded ribbons tied to trees. The forest grew darker and more oppressive as we pushed deeper. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. By the time we found the clearing Marcus had read about, we were exhausted and irritable. But I had to admit the spot was beautiful. A perfect circle of open ground next to a small, crystal-clear lake. The water was so still it looked like black glass, reflecting the darkening sky above. We set up our tents around a central fire pit and cracked open the first beers of the weekend. That first night was normal. We drank, told stories, roasted hot dogs over the fire. Tyler brought his guitar and played some old songs we remembered from college. For a few hours, it felt like the old days. 4 friends without a care in the world. It was around midnight when we first heard the sound, a low rhythmic knocking echoing from somewhere across the lake. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate strikes, then silence, then 3 more. Probably just a woodpecker, Jake suggested, but his voice was uncertain. At midnight? Marcus asked. We listened for another few minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, we chalked it up to some nocturnal animal and headed to bed. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, I could have sworn I saw a pale shape moving between the trees on the far shore. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. I should have trusted my instincts and insisted we pack up right then. But I didn't want to be the one to ruin Marcus's bachelor party. That decision has haunted me every day since. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of Jake unzipping his tent. Through the thin nylon walls of my own tent, I could hear him stumbling around outside, muttering to himself. "Jake," I whispered, "you okay, man?" "Just need to take a leak," he replied, but his voice sounded strange, distant, like he was talking in his sleep. I heard his footsteps moving away from the campsite, heading toward the tree line. Then silence. I waited for him to come back, but minutes passed with no sound. Growing concerned, I unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite was bathed in pale moonlight. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Jake was nowhere to be seen, but I could make out a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just within the shadow of the trees, tall and perfectly still. "Jake?" I called softly. The figure didn't move or respond. In the dim light, I couldn't make out any details, just a human-shaped silhouette. But something about its posture seemed wrong, too rigid, like a statue rather than a living person. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees where the figure had been standing. Nothing. Just pine branches swaying gently in the night breeze. A few minutes later, Jake stumbled back into the clearing from a completely different direction, looking confused and disoriented. "Where were you?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I just went to piss behind those trees." He pointed to a spot near his tent, nowhere close to where I'd seen the figure. "I saw you over by the tree line," I insisted. Jake shook his head. "Nah, man. You must have been dreaming or something. I never left this area." But I knew what I'd seen. And as Jake crawled back into his tent, I noticed mud on his boots. Wet, dark mud that definitely hadn't come from the dry ground around our campsite. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and once what sounded like whispered voices just beyond the edge of hearing. When I strained to listen, the whispers would stop, leaving only the normal sounds of the night. Morning came as a relief. Tyler was already up, tending to the fire and making coffee. Marcus emerged from his tent looking refreshed and eager for the day's activities. Only Jake seemed affected by the night's strangeness. He was quiet and kept rubbing his temples like he had a headache. "Anyone else have weird dreams last night?" he asked over breakfast. "What kind of weird?" Marcus wanted to know. Jake hesitated. "I keep having these flashes of walking through the forest, but I can't remember actually getting up. And there's this voice calling to me, but I can't understand what it's saying." Tyler laughed. "Maybe you were sleepwalking. My mom used to do that when she was stressed." But I remembered the figure at the tree line and Jake's muddy boots. Whatever had happened last night, it wasn't sleepwalking. Something had drawn him out into the forest, and I was beginning to suspect we weren't as alone out here as we'd thought. Saturday morning started normally enough. We planned to hike around the lake and explore some of the deeper trails Marcus had marked on his map. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with brilliant sunshine filtering through the canopy above. But as we walked along the shoreline, we started noticing things that didn't quite fit. The first was a series of deep gouges in the bark of several trees near the water's edge. They were too high to have been made by any normal animal, at least 8 feet off the ground, and formed a strange pattern of parallel lines, like massive claw marks. "Bear?" Tyler suggested, though he sounded doubtful. "Bears don't get that big," Marcus replied, running his fingers along the grooves. "And these marks, they're too uniform, too deliberate." A little further along, we found something even stranger. Carved into a large boulder near the water was a symbol I'd never seen before. a circle with intricate geometric patterns inside, almost like a mandala, but somehow more sinister. The carving was old, weathered by years of exposure, but still clearly visible. Native American? Jake wondered. Maybe, I said, though something about the symbol made my skin crawl. It seemed to draw the eye, and the longer I looked at it, the more the patterns seemed to shift and writhe, like they were alive. We took pictures and continued our hike, but the forest felt different now. Where yesterday it had seemed merely remote and wild, today it felt actively hostile. The trees pressed in closer. The shadows seemed deeper, and more than once I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, quick flashes of pale shapes darting between the trunks. Around noon, we reached the far side of the lake and decided to rest for lunch. As we sat eating sandwiches and chips, Tyler suddenly pointed across the water. "What's that?" On the opposite shore, near where our camp was located, we could see figures moving between the trees. At first, I thought it might be other hikers who had stumbled across our site, but as we watched, it became clear that something was wrong. There were too many of them, at least 6 or 7 pale shapes moving in and out of the shadows, and their movement was wrong somehow, too fluid, too synchronized, like they were dancing to music only they could hear. "Should we head back?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. We packed quickly and started the return hike, but by the time we reached our campsite an hour later, the figures were gone. Nothing seemed disturbed. Our tents were still standing, our supplies untouched. But there was a smell in the air that hadn't been there before, sweet and cloying, like rotting flowers. And carved into the dirt near our fire pit was the same symbol we'd found on the boulder. Fresh, deep, like someone had used their fingers to gouge it into the earth. That's when Jake found the photos. He'd been going through his camera, reviewing the pictures we'd taken during the hike when he stopped and went pale. "Guys," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." The photos told a story we hadn't noticed while living it. In almost every shot, lurking in the background among the trees, were pale figures, sometimes just one, sometimes several, always watching, always following. In one particularly clear image, taken when we'd stopped to examine the claw marks, you could make out details of the nearest figure, impossibly tall and thin, with skin like parchment and eyes that reflected the camera flash like an animal's. Its face was almost human, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a normal person and pulled them like taffy. We stared at the photos in horrified silence. None of us had seen these things while we were hiking. They'd been invisible to us, hidden in the shadows, but the camera had captured them perfectly. "What the hell are they?" Tyler whispered. None of us had an answer. That evening, we huddled around the fire like primitive humans, afraid of what lurked beyond the light. The photos had shaken all of us, but we were too deep in the wilderness to simply pack up and leave. It would be dark soon, and hiking out through unfamiliar forest at night seemed even more dangerous than staying put. We tried to act normal, cooking dinner and sharing stories, but every sound from the forest made us jump. And there were a lot of sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that rhythmic knocking we'd heard the first night, now coming from multiple directions around the lake. Knock, 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 always 3 times, never more, never less. As darkness fell, the activity increased. We could see them now, pale shapes moving between the trees, always just at the edge of our vision. When we turned to look directly, they would freeze, becoming indistinguishable from tree trunks or shadows. But in our peripheral vision, they were constantly in motion, circling our campsite like wolves. "Why don't they just attack?" Marcus whispered, throwing another log on the fire. The flames leaped higher, pushing back the darkness a few more feet. "Maybe they're afraid of the fire," Tyler suggested. But I had a different theory. "I think they're studying us." As if responding to my words, the knocking sound stopped. The forest fell completely silent. No insects, no wind, no normal night sounds at all. The pale figures became perfectly still, and I could feel their attention focused on us like a physical weight. Then Jake started talking. "We should go to them," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. It was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting something he'd memorized. What? Marcus stared at him. They're calling to us. Can't you hear them? They want to show us something. Jake stood up from his place by the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors. Tyler grabbed his arm. Sit down, man. You're freaking us out. But Jake pulled free with surprising strength. You don't understand. They've been waiting so long. They need us to complete the circle. He started walking toward the tree line, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by inexpert strings. I jumped up and tackled him before he could reach the shadows, wrestling him to the ground near the fire. Jake, snap out of it! For a moment, he struggled against me with inhuman strength, his fingers clawing at my arms and face. Then suddenly, he went limp and blinked in confusion. What happened? Why am I on the ground? We helped him back to his seat by the fire, but he claimed not to remember standing up or trying to leave. As far as he knew, he'd been sitting there the whole time, listening to the sounds from the forest. The rest of the night passed intense vigil. We took turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep, but none of us got much rest. The pale figures continued their endless circling, and every few hours, one of us would start to stand up with that same blank expression Jake had worn, muttering about joining them in the forest. By dawn, we were exhausted and terrified. The figures had disappeared with the sunrise, but we all knew they would be back when darkness fell again. And next time, they might be stronger, more persistent. We had to get out of those woods before night fell again, no matter what it took. We broke camp at first light, stuffing our gear into backpacks with shaking hands. None of us talked about what had happened during the night. Jake's strange behavior, the constant feeling of being watched, the way each of us had felt compelled to walk into the forest. We just wanted to get back to civilization as quickly as possible. The hike out should have taken us 6 hours, following the same faded trail we'd used to get in. But within the first hour, we realized something was wrong. The trail markers, those strips of faded ribbon tied to trees, were gone. Not just missing, but completely absent, as if they'd never existed in the first place. We must have taken a wrong turn, Marcus said, studying his compass and map. But the compass needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. This is impossible, Tyler muttered, tapping the face of his GPS unit. The screen showed nothing but static. It was working fine yesterday. We backtracked, trying to find the path we'd followed in, but the forest seemed to have rearranged itself overnight. Trails that should have been there weren't. Landmarks we remembered had vanished, and every direction we tried led us deeper into the woods instead of out. By noon, we were hopelessly lost. That's when we started seeing them in daylight. At first it was just glimpses, pale shapes flitting between distant trees, always at the very edge of our vision. But as the day wore on, they became bolder. We could see them clearly now, standing motionless among the pines, watching our every move. They were definitely not human, despite their roughly humanoid shape. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin was the color of bleached bone, and their faces were blank expanses of flesh with holes where eyes and mouths should be. Yet somehow, I could feel them watching us, following our every movement with those empty sockets. Don't look directly at them, I warned the others. I think that's what triggers their response. But it was hard not to look. They were everywhere now, forming a loose circle around us as we stumbled through the forest. Sometimes they would move closer, forcing us to change direction. Other times they would block paths entirely, standing like pale sentinels until we found another route. They were herding us, driving us deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. As afternoon faded toward evening, we stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller than our campsite, surrounded by ancient standing stones covered in those same twisted symbols we'd seen carved into the boulder. The stones formed a perfect circle, and in the center was a depression in the earth filled with what looked like ash and charred bone fragments. We need to keep moving, I said, but Jake had already walked to the center of the circle. Look at this, he called, kneeling beside the ash pit. There are symbols here too, and they're beautiful. There was that same flat, emotionless tone in his voice that we'd heard the night before. Tyler and Marcus started toward him, their eyes taking on that same blank expression. "Stop!" I shouted, but they kept walking. All three of my friends now stood in the center of the circle, staring down at the symbols carved into the stone around the ash pit. The pale figures emerged from the forest, no longer hiding among the trees. Dozens of them, all moving with that same fluid, synchronized motion. They surrounded the stone circle but didn't enter it, just stood there watching my friends with their empty eye sockets. Then Jake began to speak, but the words weren't English. They weren't any language I'd ever heard. Harsh, guttural sounds that seemed to hurt my ears. Marcus and Tyler joined in, their voices blending into a horrible chorus that made the air itself vibrate with wrongness. I realized with growing horror that they were completing some kind of ritual, and I was the only one still free to stop them. I ran toward the stone circle, shouting my friends' names, but it was like they couldn't hear me. They continued their inhuman chanting, their voices growing louder and more discordant with each passing moment. The symbols carved into the standing stones began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. The pale figures surrounding the circle swayed in rhythm with the chanting, their movements becoming more frenzied. Some of them had begun to change, their already distorted features stretching and warping into even more grotesque configurations. Whatever they were, this ritual was transforming them into something worse. As I reached the edge of the circle, an invisible barrier stopped me cold. It felt like trying to push through thick glass. I could see through it, but couldn't break it. My friends were only a few feet away, but they might as well have been on another planet. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the ash pit in the center of the circle erupted into flames. But these weren't normal flames. They burned cold and blue, casting everything in an eerie underwater light. In the fire, shapes began to form. Writhing, tentacled things that defied description, as if someone was reaching through from another dimension. Jake suddenly stopped chanting and looked directly at me, but his eyes were gone, replaced by the same empty sockets as the pale figures. When he smiled, his mouth opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Join us," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "Complete the circle." Marcus and Tyler turned toward me as well, their faces showing the same horrible transformation. Whatever had taken them wasn't content with 3 sacrifices. It wanted all 4 of us. I stumbled backward, finally understanding what was happening. These things, whatever they were, had been waiting in the forest for who knows how long, drawing people deeper into the wilderness to serve as vessels for some ancient ritual. The symbols, the herding behavior, the way they'd isolated us from civilization. It had all been leading to this moment. But they needed willing participants. That's why they'd spent so much time studying us, learning how to manipulate our thoughts and behavior. The compulsion to walk into the forest, Jake's sleepwalking episode, the way our equipment had failed when we tried to leave. They'd been slowly breaking down our resistance, preparing us for this final step. The barrier around the circle flickered, and I realized it was weakening. The transformation of my friends was almost complete. Their skin was taking on that same pale, parchment-like quality as the other creatures. Soon, they would become permanent guardians of this place, waiting to lure in the next group of victims. I had to act fast. Remembering my pocket knife, I pulled it out and drew the blade across my palm, letting blood drip onto the ground. The pale figures recoiled with hissing sounds, and the barrier around the circle wavered even more. The creatures didn't like fresh blood. It disrupted their ritual somehow. I squeezed my cut hand, letting more blood flow, and the barrier finally collapsed entirely. I lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the shoulders and shaking him violently. "Fight it! You're still in there somewhere." For just a moment, his empty eye sockets flickered, and I saw a glimmer of my old friend looking back at me. "Run," he whispered in his normal voice. "It's too late for us, but you can still get away. Run." Then the thing wearing Jake's face let out an inhuman shriek and lashed out with claws that hadn't been there a moment before. I dodged backward as Marcus and Tyler converged on me, their movements now completely inhuman. The pale figures began closing in from all sides. I had seconds before they overwhelmed me completely. I turned and ran into the forest, leaving my transformed friends behind in that cursed circle of stones. I crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I fled from the stone circle. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not just the pale figures, but the things that had been my friends. Their inhuman shrieks echoing through the trees. They moved differently now. Where before the pale figures had been eerily graceful, the transformed versions of Jake, Marcus, and Tyler were violent and chaotic, smashing through undergrowth like wild animals. But they were fast, impossibly fast, and I could hear them gaining on me with every step. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep running. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting as far away from that ritual site as possible. In my terror, I'd lost all sense of direction. For all I knew, I was running deeper into the wilderness instead of toward civilization. A root caught my foot, and I went down hard, rolling through dead leaves and pine needles. As I struggled to get back up, I heard them getting closer. The sound of breaking branches and that awful chittering noise the pale figures made when they moved. I scrambled behind a fallen log just as the first of them burst into the small clearing where I'd fallen. It had been Jake once, but now it was something else entirely. Its limbs had stretched and elongated, giving it an insect-like quality. Its face was a nightmare of exposed bone and gaping wounds, with those needle teeth protruding from its distended jaw. It sniffed the air like an animal, trying to locate my scent. Two more creatures emerged from the forest, the things that had been Marcus and Tyler. They spread out, methodically searching the area while making that horrible chittering sound to each other. I held my breath and pressed myself against the rotting bark of the fallen tree, praying they wouldn't find me. One of them, Tyler, I think, passed within inches of my hiding spot, close enough that I could smell the putrid odor rising from its transformed flesh. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they moved on, disappearing deeper into the forest. I waited until their sounds faded completely before daring to move. As I crept out from behind the log, I noticed something that made my heart leap with hope. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, I could see electric lights. Not the cold phosphorescence of the ritual stones, but warm yellow light that meant human habitation. I started toward the lights, moving as quietly as possible. Every sound made me freeze and listen for signs of pursuit, but the forest around me remained silent. Too silent. Even the normal nighttime sounds of insects and small animals were absent, as if the presence of those creatures had driven away all natural life. The lights turned out to be coming from a small hunting cabin tucked into a grove of birch trees. It looked abandoned, the windows were dark, and there was no smoke from the chimney. But it represented the first sign of civilization I'd seen since our ordeal began. I approached carefully, half expecting it to be another trap. But the cabin appeared genuinely empty. The door was unlocked, and inside I found basic supplies, canned food, bottled water, and most importantly, a battery-powered radio. I tried every frequency, desperate to reach someone, anyone who could help. Finally, on an emergency channel, I picked up the voice of a park ranger. "This is Ranger Station Alpha. Anyone copy?" "Please help me," I gasped into the microphone. "I'm lost in the Allagash wilderness. My friends, something happened to my friends. They're gone." There was a pause, then, "Son, what's your location? We'll send help right away." I gave him what details I could about the cabin and the surrounding area. He promised to have a search team to me by morning, told me to stay put and keep the radio on. But as I sat in that dark cabin, waiting for rescue, I could hear them out there in the forest. The chittering sounds, the snapping of branches. They were still looking for me, still hunting. And somewhere among those sounds I heard familiar voices calling my name. Jake, Marcus, Tyler, or the things that had taken their forms, trying to lure me back outside. I huddled in the corner of the cabin with a hunting knife I'd found in a drawer, knowing that my real ordeal was just beginning. The rescue team found me at dawn, huddled in the corner of that hunting cabin, clutching the knife and muttering incoherently about pale figures and twisted rituals. I'd apparently been there for 3 days, though it felt like mere hours to me. They were kind, but skeptical. Search and rescue teams scoured the wilderness for weeks, looking for any trace of Jake, Marcus, and Tyler. They found our original campsite, exactly as we'd left it. They found the stone circle where the ritual had taken place, but the symbols I remembered seeing were weathered and faded, centuries old according to the archaeologist they brought in. What they didn't find were my friends, or any evidence that they'd ever been in those woods with me. The official report concluded that I'd suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. The story I told about pale creatures and ritual transformations was dismissed as elaborate hallucinations. My friends, according to the investigation, had never come on the camping trip at all. I'd apparently hiked into the wilderness alone and constructed an entire fantasy to cope with whatever had actually happened to me out there. They showed me the evidence. Credit card records showing that Jake had been in Boston the entire weekend, working overtime at his accounting firm. Security footage of Marcus at his apartment complex, never leaving. Tyler's girlfriend provided an alibi. They'd spent the weekend together at her parents' house upstate. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to my friends in those woods. The thing is, they came back. About a month after the rescue, Jake called me. He sounded perfectly normal, concerned about my mental health and wondering if I wanted to get together for drinks. When I accused him of being one of those creatures, he laughed it off and suggested I talk to my therapist about paranoid delusions. Marcus and Tyler reached out too, separately, both expressing the same concern for my well-being. They remembered our friendship, our shared history, even inside jokes from college. But there were subtle differences. Jake's laugh was a little too perfect. Marcus blinked too infrequently. Tyler's smile never quite reached his eyes, and sometimes when they thought I wasn't looking, I caught glimpses of what they really were. A flash of empty eye sockets, limbs that bent the wrong way, that phosphorescent glow just beneath their human masks. They'd come back to maintain the illusion, to make sure no one believed my story. As far as the world was concerned, nothing had happened in the Allagash wilderness. My friends were fine. I was the one with problems. But I know the truth. Those things are still out there, wearing the faces of people I once loved, waiting for the next group of victims to wander into their territory. The ritual continues, and they're growing stronger. I've tried to warn people, I've posted on forums, created blog entries, even contacted paranormal investigators. But there's always a rational explanation, always evidence that contradicts my story. My friends have made sure of that. So I'm writing this final account, posting it here where maybe someone will listen. If you're planning a camping trip to northern Maine, stay away from the deep woods around Allagash. Don't follow unmarked trails. Don't trust faded ribbons tied to trees. And if you see pale figures watching you from the forest, don't investigate. Don't try to make contact. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't stop until you're back in civilization. Because if you don't, you might end up like my friends, transformed into something that wears a human face, but serves an ancient hunger that can never be satisfied. I've been having the dreams again lately. Dreams of walking through dark forests, following whispered voices that call my name. I wake up with mud on my feet and pine needles in my hair, even though I live in a downtown apartment now, miles from the nearest trees. They're calling me back. The ritual isn't complete yet. They still need their fourth participant, and I don't know how much longer I can resist their pull. If you find this story and I've disappeared, you'll know where I've gone. Don't come looking for me. Don't trust anyone who claims to be my friend if they show up after I'm gone. Just remember, sometimes the only way to survive is to run, and keep running, until the voices in the forest finally fall silent. But they never really do. They're calling to me now, as I write these final words, promising me peace, promising me reunion with my friends, promising an end to the fear and isolation I've lived with for months. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to complete the circle. This post was found on the user's computer after his disappearance. Local authorities conducted another search of the Allagash wilderness, but found no trace of him. The case remains open, though it has been classified as a probable suicide. His friends Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tyler Brooks were questioned but had solid alibis for the time of his disappearance. They expressed sadness about his deteriorating mental state and wished they could have done more to help him.
The trail disappeared beneath a canopy of old-growth pines as I pushed deeper into the Adirondack wilderness. 3 days of solitary hiking stretched ahead of me, a necessary reprieve from months of grinding deadlines and fluorescent office lighting. I'd selected the unmarked northern route specifically because rangers at the station had mentioned how few hikers ventured there. Most folks stick to the marked trails, the older ranger had said, his weathered face creasing with concern as he studied my planned route. This area gets mighty isolated. That was precisely the point. I needed isolation. What I didn't need was the strange warning he'd added as I turned to leave. "Watch yourself up there," he'd said, voice dropping. Especially after dark. Local tribes had stories about those woods. Stories about things that, well, let's just say there's good reason that trail's unofficial. I'd laughed it off then. Indigenous folklore was fascinating, but hardly a deterrent for an experienced backpacker. 5 hours of hiking later, with the September sun slipping behind jagged peaks, I wasn't laughing anymore. The first strange incident occurred around dusk. I'd set up camp in a small clearing beside a stream, tent erected, fire crackling, freeze-dried dinner rehydrating in its pouch. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a strained silence that pressed against my eardrums. Even the stream seemed to muffle its babbling. Movement caught my eye across the clearing, just a shadow passing between distant trees. Probably a deer, I reasoned. Yet something about the silhouette seemed wrong. Too tall, too thin, too deliberate in its movements. I blinked and it was gone. Sleep came uneasily that night. Twice I jolted awake, certain I'd heard footsteps circling my tent. The second time, I unzipped the flap and peered out into absolute darkness. My headlamp illuminated nothing but trees and underbrush, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. I secured the tent and kept my hunting knife close. Morning arrived gray and misty. As I packed my gear, I discovered odd impressions in the dirt surrounding my campsite. Not quite footprints, but elongated depressions that started and stopped illogically. A peculiar arrangement of stones had appeared near my fire pit. 3 rocks positioned in a perfect triangle with a smaller stone in the center. I hadn't put them there. I shouldered my pack and continued north, consulting my topographical map. According to local information, an abandoned fire tower stood 8 miles ahead, my destination for day 2. The trail grew increasingly faint, requiring careful navigation through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. By midday, sweat drenched my shirt despite the cool air. At a small stream crossing, I paused to refill water bottles. The reflection in the clear water showed exhaustion etched across my face. But something else registered in my peripheral vision, a figure standing among the trees behind me, watching. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only forest. 2 miles later, I found the first inexplicable artifact. A crude stick figure hanging from a low branch across the trail. 2 crossed sticks bound with what looked like hair. Indigenous artwork from hikers. Teenagers playing pranks. The rational explanations didn't dispel my unease. 3 more appeared over the next mile, each more elaborate than the last. The 4th incorporated bones, small ones, likely from rodents. I photographed them before moving on, unable to shake the feeling they'd been placed specifically for me to find. The fire tower appeared through the trees around 4 p.m., a rusted metal skeleton against the darkening sky. Its presence should have been reassuring, but something felt wrong. The clearing surrounding it was too silent. No birds called, no insects buzzed, just oppressive silence and the creaking of metal in the rising wind. I climbed carefully, testing each step on the weathered stairs. From the observation platform, I could see for miles, endless forest canopy rolling toward distant mountains. Beautiful, yet somehow threatening in its vastness. I decided to camp inside the tower's base level rather than outside exposed in the clearing. As darkness fell, I prepared a cold dinner, unwilling to risk a fire that might attract attention. The metal walls provided an illusion of security as I arranged my sleeping bag and emergency radio. Just after midnight, the scratching began. Light at first, like branches against metal, then more deliberate. Rhythmic. Almost like communication. I sat frozen, listening to the methodical scratching move around the tower's perimeter. When it reached the door, it stopped. Seconds passed in complete silence before 3 distinct knocks sounded, as purposeful as a visitor announcing their presence. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. The knocking repeated, louder. Then a voice, or something approximating a voice, called my name. Not my full name, but the nickname only my closest friends used. A strangled, guttural approximation that sounded like it came from a throat not designed for human speech. How did it know? How could it possibly know? I clutched my knife and waited as the scratching resumed, continuing for hours until gray dawn finally broke through the tower's small windows. When I gathered the courage to examine the exterior in the morning light, long vertical gouges marked the metal walls, some deep enough to penetrate the aged steel. I left with first light, abandoning my plan to spend another night in the wilderness. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, they knew I was alone. They knew my name, and they were closing in. I headed east toward the nearest marked trail, hoping to intercept day hikers or rangers. My map showed a junction approximately 7 miles away. A grueling day's hike through increasingly difficult terrain, but my only viable option for reaching civilization quickly. The forest felt different that morning. The trees seemed to lean inward, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. Twice I lost the trail completely, forced to backtrack and search for subtle markers. By noon, an unsettling realization took hold. The landmarks weren't matching my map. Either the map was wrong, or I was being deliberately led astray. Around 2 o'clock, I emerged into a small meadow dotted with wildflowers. At its center stood a solitary tree stump, unnaturally flat on top. Something compelled me to approach it. Arranged carefully on the weathered surface were 3 items. A tarnished compass that spun erratically, a small animal skull, rabbit perhaps, and a faded photograph. I picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. The image showed a group of hikers standing before a familiar landscape, the very mountains visible from the fire tower. Their faces were scratched out with something sharp, all except one. Mine. It was impossible. The photo came from my college hiking club, taken 5 years earlier during a completely different trip hundreds of miles from here. I kept it tucked in a photo album in my apartment. No one could have accessed it. I dropped the photo and backed away, nearly tripping over exposed roots. The woods had gone silent again, that same oppressive silence from the previous day. I grabbed my backpack and ran, no longer caring about following any trail, driven only by the need to put distance between myself and that meadow. The terrain grew steeper. Clouds rolled in, dark and threatening. The first raindrops fell as I scrambled up a rocky slope, seeking higher ground and better visibility. Lightning flashed, temporarily blinding me. In the afterimage, I glimpsed a figure standing among distant trees, tall, impossibly thin, watching. When my vision cleared, nothing was there. Rain fell in sheets as I found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff face. The small cave-like recess offered protection from the downpour but trapped me as darkness approached, No chance of reaching the trail junction before nightfall. I would have to make camp here and continue at first light. With shaking hands, I set up my emergency tent, arranged my sleeping bag, and prepared a cold dinner from remaining rations. My phone showed no signal. Not surprising given the remote location and storm. The GPS function still worked, though, and confirmed my worst fears. I had somehow been moving in a wide circle, ending up just 3 miles northeast of the fire tower. Nearly a full day of hiking had gained me almost nothing. As the storm intensified, I noticed markings on the cave walls, crude pictures etched into stone. Some appeared ancient, hunters pursuing deer, astronomical symbols, while others seemed disturbingly recent. One drawing in particular caught my attention, stick figures fleeing from a tall, emaciated form with elongated limbs. Above it, scratched in what looked like modern English, "It wears their faces." Local legends about skinwalkers surfaced from my memory. Shape-shifting witches from Navajo folklore who could assume animal forms or, more terrifyingly, mimic specific humans after learning enough about them. The ranger's warning took on new significance. I told myself these were just stories. Just myths designed to explain predators or warn children away from dangerous areas. But alone in that cave, with lightning illuminating nightmare shapes in the forest below, rational thought proved difficult to maintain. The rain continued for hours. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every crack of thunder. During one such moment of consciousness, I became aware of a sound beneath the storm's fury. Rhythmic tapping outside the cave entrance. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but sheets of rain and swaying branches. The tapping continued, moving around the perimeter of my shelter. Then whispers, so faint I strained to hear them beneath the storm, yet somehow simultaneously inside my head. My name again, in that same strangled approximation of human speech, followed by words I couldn't quite decipher. A lightning flash revealed a figure crouched at the cave entrance, humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways. 2 long limbs folded at impossible angles, skin that didn't sit right on its frame, like an ill-fitting suit. Eyes reflecting my flashlight beam with unnatural brightness. I scrambled backward, pressing against the cave wall. When lightning flashed again, the entrance was empty. Sleep became impossible. I spent the remaining hours of darkness huddled against the rock face, knife in hand, listening to that rhythmic tapping circle my position. With first light, the rain finally subsided, revealing a forest draped in mist. Outside the cave, pressed into mud, I found tracks. Not animal prints, not quite human either. They approached from the forest, circled the cave's perimeter exactly where I'd heard the tapping, then vanished mid-stride as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. More disturbing was what I found hanging from a branch directly outside my shelter, my college ID card, which had been safely stored in my apartment back in the city. I gathered my gear with frantic energy. As I shouldered my pack, something caught my attention on the cave wall where I'd been sitting, a fresh etching I hadn't noticed in the darkness. A crude representation of a person sleeping in a cave, with a tall, thin figure standing over them. The sleeper's face was scratched away. Whatever was hunting me had been inside the cave while I slept. The forest floor remained treacherous after the night's downpour. Twice I slipped on mud-slicked rocks, the second fall wrenching my ankle painfully. I fashioned a makeshift brace using a bandana and pushed onward, determined to reach the marked trail junction before nightfall. My mind raced through explanations for what was happening. A deranged hunter targeting hikers? Some territorial mountaineer trying to scare visitors away? Each theory seemed plausible until I remembered the photograph, my college ID, items that couldn't possibly be here. Around midday, I discovered fresh boot prints on the trail, normal human prints heading east. Another hiker. I followed eagerly, moving as quickly as my injured ankle allowed. The prints led to a small clearing where they abruptly transformed into those same unnatural tracks I'd seen outside the cave, as if the hiker had morphed mid-stride into something else. I leaned against a tree, fighting waves of nausea. The implications were too horrifying to contemplate. I checked my map again, recalculated my position using visible landmarks, and estimated another 4 hours to the junction. If I maintained a steady pace, I might reach it before dark. The forest grew denser as the afternoon progressed. Pine branches closed overhead, blocking much of the already fading sunlight. The path narrowed, sometimes disappearing completely beneath thick underbrush. I began marking my route with bright orange surveyor's tape from my emergency kit, tying strips to branches at regular intervals. 3 hours later, I saw something that stopped me cold. Ahead on the trail hung strips of orange tape, identical to mine, except I hadn't been this way before. I approached cautiously, examining the nearest piece. The knot was precisely the same distinctive style I'd been using. Something was mimicking my actions, anticipating my route. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I spun toward the sound, heartbeat thundering in my ears. Nothing visible through the dense foliage, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I picked up a sturdy branch as a makeshift weapon and continued forward, constantly scanning my surroundings. The junction appeared ahead just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, a wooden trail marker indicating routes to the ranger station, 7 miles, and Black Pine Lake, 3 miles. Relief flooded through me at this sign of established civilization. The ranger station was too far with night approaching, and my injured ankle increasingly painful. The lake, however, often featured campsites with other hikers, safety in numbers. I turned toward the lake, moving quickly despite my fatigue. The trail here was well maintained, allowing faster progress. As darkness gathered, I switched on my headlamp and pressed forward. The forest opened occasionally, providing glimpses of stars appearing in the twilight sky. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. The attack came without warning. Something struck me from behind with enough force to send me sprawling face first onto the trail. My headlamp flew off, plunging me into darkness. I rolled instinctively, bringing up the branch as a shield just as a weight descended. In the struggle, my fingers brushed against something that felt horribly like a human face. But wrong, texture all wrong, like leather poorly stretched over bone. I kicked out blindly, connecting with something solid. A high, inhuman shriek pierced the night as the weight lifted. I scrambled for my fallen headlamp, fingers closing around it just as crashing sounds indicated my attacker retreating through underbrush. The beam revealed nothing but swaying branches and disturbed leaves. Blood trickled from a gash on my forehead, and my pack had been partially torn open. Shaking uncontrollably, I checked the damage. Some food gone, my map missing, water bottle punctured. The emergency radio remained intact, though it had yet to pick up any frequencies since I'd entered this region. I couldn't stay here. Despite my exhaustion, I pushed onward toward the lake, hoping desperately for the safety of other campers. The trail descended sharply, switchbacking through rock outcroppings. My headlamp caught reflections ahead. Water. Black Pine Lake. The shore appeared deserted. No tents, no campfires, no signs of human presence. I had gambled and lost. Whatever stalked me now had me cornered against the water with darkness fallen completely. I found a defensible position, a jumble of large boulders near the shore, and wedged myself into a crevice where nothing could approach unseen. The night stretched endlessly as strange calls echoed across the lake. Not quite animal, not quite human. Sometimes they seemed to answer each other from different directions. Sometimes they mimicked my own voice, calling for help. Around midnight, the voices changed tactics. I heard my mother's voice calling my name. Impossible, as she had passed away 3 years earlier. Then my close friend's voice, pleading for assistance. My ex-partner, claiming to be injured. Each voice perfect in its recreation, yet fundamentally wrong in subtle ways that raise the hair on my neck. It wears their faces, the cave etching had warned. The skinwalker legends described creatures that could mimic voices after hearing them just once. Light appeared across the lake, a bobbing flashlight approaching the shore. Human voices called out, "Actual hikers?" I nearly responded before noticing something crucial. The light moved unnaturally, too smooth, never shifting with footsteps on uneven ground. The voices maintained perfect volume despite changing distance. I remained silent, watching as 3 lights now moved along the distant shore. They stopped directly across from my position, beams pointing toward me, though I remained hidden in shadow. After several minutes, they extinguished simultaneously. Something entered the water. Ripples spread across the lake's surface, visible in the moonlight. Something was swimming toward me. I pressed deeper into my crevice, clutching my knife. The splashing stopped halfway across the lake. Minutes passed in silence before a dark shape emerged from the water, not at the shore but impossibly, 50 feet inland and behind my position. I heard it moving through the trees, circling my hideout. Water dripped as it passed, accompanied by a wet, slithering sound like sodden clothes dragging across rock. It paused just outside my field of vision, breathing with a ragged, uneven rhythm. My radio crackled suddenly, the first signal it had detected since entering the forest. Through bursts of static, a voice emerged. Immediate evacuation. Dangerous individual in northwestern sector. Armed and extremely dangerous. All hikers returned to ranger stations. The presence outside froze. The breathing stopped. Then, impossibly, the same warning repeated from the darkness. A perfect mimicry of the radio transmission, but coming from directly behind me. Dawn revealed what night had concealed. A landscape transformed by my pursuers' nocturnal activities. Dozens of stick figures hung from surrounding trees, dancing in the morning breeze. Stones arranged in intricate patterns encircled my hideout. Most disturbing were the photographs. Images from my own life strung between branches like grotesque decorations. Me at graduation. Me at my mother's funeral. Me hiking with friends in places far from here. All with my face meticulously removed. I had no memory of bringing these photographs. They had been stored in albums at my apartment. Their presence here defied explanation. My ankle had swollen significantly overnight, the pain now excruciating with each step. The ranger station lay 7 miles away, according to the trail marker. A journey that would typically take 3 hours, but might now require double that time. I fashioned a walking stick from a fallen branch and set out, constantly scanning for movement among the trees. The trail wound through dense forest before opening onto a ridge offering expansive views of the valley below. In the distance, I could make out buildings, the ranger station, my destination. So close, yet impossibly far given my condition. I activated my emergency radio again, broadcasting distress calls on all frequencies. Only static answered. The battery indicator blinked red, perhaps 1 hour of power remaining. I switched it off to conserve energy for when I might be closer to civilization. The ridge trail narrowed dangerously, with steep drop-offs to my right. As I navigated a particularly treacherous section, I noticed something unusual. Fresh boot prints in the muddy trail ahead. Normal human prints, similar to those I'd followed yesterday before they transformed. A hiker? A ranger? Or another trick? I followed cautiously, alert for any sign of deception. The prints maintained their human appearance for nearly a mile before I discovered their source. A single boot abandoned on the trail, its mate nowhere to be found. Beside it lay a ranger's hat, brim stained with what appeared to be dried blood. A trap, then. I diverted from the trail, choosing instead to parallel it through the underbrush, slower going but offering better concealment. The day grew unusually warm for September, sweat soaking my shirt as I pushed through dense vegetation. My water supply had dwindled to half a bottle, forcing careful rationing. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered perhaps 3 miles, less than half the distance to safety. My injured ankle had begun to alter my gait, each step sending jolts of pain up my leg. I paused in a small clearing to rest, propping my foot on a fallen log to reduce swelling. The quiet snap of a twig brought me instantly alert. 20 yards away, partially obscured by foliage, stood a figure. Human in general outline, but wrong in all particulars. Limbs too long, joints bending in impossible directions, head cocked at an unnatural angle. It wore what appeared to be standard hiking clothes, but they hung oddly on its frame, as if the body beneath didn't match the garments designed for human proportions. Most disturbing was its face, or rather the absence of clearly defined features. In their place was a shadowed suggestion of eyes, nose, and mouth that seemed to shift and reform when viewed directly. The longer I stared, the more its facial features resembled my own. Neither of us moved. It made no aggressive action, simply observing with that not-quite face. After nearly a minute of this standoff, it retreated backward into the forest without turning around, maintaining eye contact until foliage concealed it completely. I abandoned any pretense of rest and continued immediately, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle. The encounter had confirmed my worst fears. Whatever pursued me was neither fully human nor animal, but something that existed in the terrible space between categories. The trail descended steeply into a ravine where a wooden footbridge spanned a rushing stream. Halfway across, I spotted a familiar orange surveyor's tape tied to the railing, identical to what I'd been using to mark my route yesterday. Attached to it was a torn page from my own journal, containing entries from months ago. Words had been circled seemingly at random, forming a new message when read sequentially. I know where you sleep. I know your voice. I know your face. I will wear it soon. I crossed the bridge quickly and continued uphill, driven by fresh terror. The trail split at a junction, one path continuing toward the ranger station, another leading to an overlook according to a weathered sign. I took the main path, pushing my deteriorating body to its limits. Late afternoon brought me to a clearing containing a small, dilapidated cabin, likely an old Forest Service outpost. Its windows were boarded, door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Desperate for shelter with night approaching, I approached cautiously. The interior remained largely intact. A single room with basic furniture including a metal frame bed, wooden table, and cast iron stove. Dust covered everything, undisturbed for what appeared to be years. I closed and barricaded the door using the table, then checked the boarded windows for security. Only after establishing these basic precautions did I notice the wall opposite the door, covered entirely with photographs. My photographs, hundreds of them, documenting nearly my entire life from childhood onward. School portraits, family gatherings, recent hiking trips. Many I recognized from my own collection. Others appeared to have been taken without my knowledge. Me shopping, me at restaurants, me entering my apartment building. In each image, my face had been meticulously removed, not torn or cut out, but carefully burned away, leaving perfect oval holes in the paper. Below this grotesque collage, written in what appeared to be dried blood, "Your face is almost mine." I backed toward the door, planned a shelter forgotten. As I moved the table barricade, something heavy thudded onto the roof. Dust showered down as footsteps traversed the ceiling, slow, deliberate steps too heavy for any forest animal. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. A scratching sound followed, then silence. Seconds later, something began to emerge from the chimney, impossibly long, joint-bent limbs feeling blindly along the stove's cold surface. I abandoned all pretense of quietness, throwing aside the barricade and bursting outside. Twilight had fallen, the forest rapidly darkening around me. I ran blindly, no longer following any trail, driven only by the need to put distance between myself and the cabin. Behind me, something crashed through underbrush in pursuit, moving faster than any human could navigate the difficult terrain. A fallen tree blocked my path. As I clambered over it, my weakened ankle gave way completely. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling uncontrollably through brush and over rocks before coming to rest at the bottom. Pain exploded through my body, ankle definitely broken now, ribs possibly cracked, face lacerated from branches. I lay there, unable to move, waiting for my pursuer to find me. Minutes passed. The forest had gone completely silent. Not even insect sounds penetrated the heavy stillness. Gradually, painfully, I pulled myself upright against a tree trunk, surveying my surroundings. Ahead through the trees glimmered electric lights, the ranger station, perhaps half a mile away across difficult terrain. So close, yet in my condition, it might as well have been on another continent. Gathering my remaining strength, I began to crawl toward those distant lights, using my arms to drag my battered body forward inch by agonizing inch. Behind me, something moved through the darkened forest. The race for survival had reached its final phase. Time lost meaning as I dragged myself toward those distant lights. My world narrowed to the next handhold, the next route to pull against, the next few inches gained. Behind me, something maintained a constant distance, neither closing in for the kill nor falling behind. Sometimes I heard it moving parallel to my route, crashing through underbrush to my left or right, playing with me. The forest opened onto a maintenance road, gravel, rarely used but unmistakably human-made. The ranger station lights appeared much closer now, perhaps a quarter-mile along this road. I pulled myself onto the gravel surface and continued my agonizing progress, leaving smears of blood on the pale stones. My pursuer grew bolder as we approached civilization. Twice it crossed the road ahead of me, visible only as a dark silhouette against the night sky, impossibly tall and thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Each time it crossed, it paused to observe me before disappearing again into the forest. The third time, it stopped in the middle of the road. Moonlight revealed what daylight had partly concealed, a nightmare figure that approximated human form while violating every principle of natural anatomy. Limbs bent at additional joints, torso elongated and unnaturally narrow. It wore tattered clothing that might once have belonged to another hiker. Its face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze. Hungry, calculating, patient. It made no move toward me, simply blocking the path to safety. "What do you want?" I croaked, voice barely functional after hours without water. It cocked its head at an impossible angle considering. When it finally spoke, the sound emerged as a horrifying approximation of human speech, like someone learning words phonetically without understanding language. "Your face," it said, using my own voice. "Your life. Your stories." It took a step forward, movements fluid yet wrong, like watching a film of normal human locomotion played at odd intervals. "Others came before. Others will come after. But you," it continued, voice shifting between mimicry of mine and other tones I didn't recognize. "You noticed me. You see me. Special." It extended one grotesquely elongated arm, fingers too numerous and too long reaching toward me. The others believed the ranger, believed the warnings, stayed on marked trails. It made a sound like broken laughter. "You came to my territory, my hunting ground." Its fingers nearly reached me now. I pushed myself backward desperately, pain forgotten in pure terror. "The Navajo have stories," it continued. "Imperfect stories. I am older than their legends. Older than their people. I have worn many skins." Headlights suddenly appeared on the road behind the creature, a vehicle approaching from the ranger station. The being went rigid, head snapping toward the light source. For the first time, I glimpsed its face clearly in the headlight's glare, a horrible amalgamation of features that seemed borrowed from multiple sources. Eyes too widely spaced, mouth stretched impossibly wide. The overall impression was of a poorly constructed mask made from ill-fitting parts. With unnatural speed, it retreated into the forest just as the vehicle, a ranger's truck, rounded the bend. I collapsed onto the gravel, waving frantically as the headlights illuminated my broken form. The ranger found me delirious from pain and dehydration. His radio quickly summoned emergency medical responders while he applied basic first aid to my most serious injuries. Throughout his ministrations, I babbled about what had pursued me, pointing repeatedly toward the darkened forest where I'd last seen the creature. "You're the third hiker we've rescued from this area this season," he said quietly as we waited for the ambulance. The others were in similar condition, talked about similar things. He checked his shotgun, keeping it close. Local tribes avoided these forests for centuries before white settlers arrived, he continued. Their legends speak of skinwalkers, beings that can take the form of animals or people. Most outsiders dismiss it as superstition. He scanned the tree line, expression grim. Those of us who work these woods know better. The medical team arrived within 20 minutes, a miracle given the remote location. As they loaded me into the ambulance, the ranger approached one final time. "Whatever you think you saw out there," he said, voice low. "Whatever followed you, don't speak its name once you leave here. Names have power. Attention feeds it. The more you obsess over it, the more real it becomes." He glanced toward the forest, now completely dark except for occasional sweeps of flashlights as other rangers searched the area. "And if you value your life," he added, "never return to these woods." The official report listed my injuries as consistent with a severe fall and exposure. My incoherent statements about being stalked were attributed to hallucinations from dehydration and trauma. 3 broken ribs, a shattered ankle, numerous lacerations, and a mild concussion kept me hospitalized for 9 days. During my recovery, I researched similar incidents in the region. Over the past decade, 17 hikers had been rescued after becoming lost in that same section of forest. Most described being pursued by something not quite human. Local indigenous stories described skinwalkers as witch-like beings who could assume the form of animals or humans after performing terrible rituals. They were said to stalk lone travelers, mimic loved ones' voices, and collect trophies from their victims. I found myself unable to sleep without medication. Even in the hospital, I felt watched, especially at night when shadows lengthened across my room. Twice I woke, convinced something was standing in the darkened corners, observing me with hungry patience. Upon returning to my apartment, I discovered subtle wrongness, items slightly out of place, photographs missing from albums, journal entries I couldn't remember writing. Most disturbing was finding twigs arranged in small stick figures hidden throughout my home, under the bed, behind books, inside kitchen cabinets. I moved to a different city the following month. I changed my phone number, deleted social media accounts, severed connections with anyone who might have known my whereabouts during the hiking trip. Sometimes these precautions seem excessive, paranoid even. But sometimes, especially during long nights when wind rattles the windows, I catch glimpses of a too-tall figure passing beneath streetlights outside. Sometimes the phone rings with no caller ID, and when answered, I hear only my own voice echoing back at me. The ranger's warning haunts me still. Attention feeds it. The more you obsess over it, the more real it becomes. I've told this story only once, here, now, breaking my years of silence. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps by acknowledging what happened, I've opened a door that should have remained closed. Because even as I write these final words, I can hear something moving outside my door. Footsteps too irregular to be human. Breathing too ragged to be natural. And somewhere in the darkness, my own voice calling my name.